Hello to everyone in the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral community and all of our friends. This is Father Jonathan. I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to continue our weekly series, Sunday Scripture with Father Jonathan, our meditation on the scripture reading for each Sunday. Today we will be discussing the epistle reading coming from the 10th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Romans. And in today's epistle reading, St. Paul challenges us to grow in our understanding of faith and to be more ardent in living, practicing, and doing those things that manifest our faith. Now, in doing this and being challenged this way, perhaps we might find ourselves with one of two phronimata, or worldviews, or ways of understanding and living out the reality of our faith, which ultimately sees us falling short of God's will for us. We could, on the one hand, as St. Paul writes about the Israelite people in today's epistle, have zeal for God, but one that is not enlightened. And channeling this sentiment, St. Clement of Alexandria writes, the Jews did not understand the intention of the law, and so failed to practice it. They made up their own version and thought that it was what the law intended. They had no faith in the prophetic power of the law. They followed the bare letter, not the inner meaning. That is, they feared and they didn't have faith. And taking these words of St. Clement, we could forget that righteousness does not come from our own practices. The practices of our Orthodox faith do not save us any more than the works of the law did for the Jews. We could be present at all of the services. We could fast on all the fasting days, especially before receiving the Eucharist. We could have a rule of prayer and read the scriptures daily, yet in doing these things, not submit to God's righteousness, as St. Paul writes in today's epistle. That is, not submit to God's divine plan for the salvation of the world. And I'm reminded in all of this conversation of the words of reply that St. Theophan the Recluse wrote in response to a question posed by a young woman with whom he was corresponding. She asked the saint, why is it that when people become more religious, they become worse people? I think we can all understand this reality. We know someone who might claim to be religious and appear to be doing all of the right things. They ardently argue for the minutiae of the practices of the faith and are well versed in the theology of the church, but they tear others down. They're self-righteous and oftentimes quite unpleasant to be around. St. Theophan replies with a simple but powerful word to this question. It is because such people worship everything but God. They worship the practices, the vestments, the rituals, the language of articulation, the incense, the chanting, etc. However, they do not worship God. They forget that their faith ought to be about God. This is the same truth that the Lord is conveying in the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. The latter, an expert in the law, knows all of the rules, all of the practices, the theology, the rituals. He tithes, he goes to the temple to worship, but he forgets the weightier things of the law, like love and mercy. He prays, yes, but not to God, we hear. No, Christ says he prays with himself. And worse yet, he looks at his fellow human being with self-righteous contempt, shaming the publican, the tax collector, who humbly acknowledges his shortcomings and prays for God's mercy. Christ insists that of the two, it was the publican that went away justified, that is, found to be righteous by God, namely, living in accordance with God's will by his simple act of humility, no matter the life that he was living. This is all to say that we can begin to think that merely doing all the practices will save us. That if we do everything in just the right way, all will be well. Yet like the Pharisee or the religious person who forgets to worship God, we believe we are justified by the strict adherence to a set of regulations without any attempt to live that reality or allowing such a way of life to till the soil of our hearts so that God might produce in us the fruit of the Spirit, about which we heard in last Sunday's epistle. St. John Chrysostom aptly puts it, "For if Christ be the end of the law," as St. Paul says in today's epistle, "he who does not have Christ, even if he seems to have righteousness, does not have it. But he who has Christ, even though he might not have properly fulfilled the law," or in our case, the practices of faith, "he receives the whole of Christ." Now, I said that there are perhaps two phronimata, two different ways of seeing the world, or worldviews, orientations that we might have in relation to faith based off today's epistle. And this is functionally, the second approach, is functionally quite antithetical to the way of life I described already. That is to say, on the other hand, we could think that we need not do any of the practices of faith because it is enough to be called or call ourselves a Christian, to say that we believe and thus claim to be righteous, to be justified. We could think that just professing our faith and perhaps occasionally or even regularly appearing in the church building is a sign that we can be assured of our own salvation. First, we can forget the words of St. James, "For the body apart from the Spirit is, as the body apart from the Spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is also dead." And this means that we need to remember that some of the practices of our faith, like care for the poor, acts of mercy, giving alms, is essential to our life of faith. St. Paul also says in his letter to Titus, "Those who have believed in God may be careful to devote themselves to good works." Not works of the law as ends in and of themselves, or practices of faith like fasting, prayer, and giving alms. Rather, we are called to see the things that we do as a means of actualizing the reality of our faith in our day-to-day lives. Another key thing that we might forget that connects to the two phronimata about which we are speaking is that we need to do the acts of faith, our spiritual practices, because they, in part, open us up to more sincere faith. That is, a faith lived in practice, not just in idea. However, we must be mindful that when we do these things, that the things that make up our life of faith, whether it be fasting or prayer or reading the scriptures or participating in the sacraments, giving alms, being merciful, peacemakers, generous, we need to do so with intention. That is, to do them towards their proper aim, union or communion with God, because all of these things are about God. The spiritual practices of our faith do not justify us or make us holy and righteous before God. Instead, done with the right intention, they open us up to God's transformative grace, his uncreated energies, which is the only way to our true communion with God, or to be authentically ourselves in relation to God. Apart from union with God, we remain as we are, caught somewhere between self-righteousness and apathy, knowing neither who we are nor who God is, and separated from both. So where does this all lead us today? How do we live according to the teaching of St. Paul in today's passage? Simply put, we must remember that the church and its practices are about Christ, and we live our life of faith, our spiritual life, with all of its many practices, so that we can open ourselves up to Christ, recognizing that it is God who transforms us, makes us righteous, not any outward action. So fast, though. Pray. Come to church. Be merciful, generous, and loving. But do it with the intention, with the right intention, so God can produce in us the fruit that comes from our union with Him. And this is today's epistle message. This is the life we're called to live, in whatever form it takes, where we are, how we are, and our unique and unrepeatable circumstances as unique and unrepeatable persons. We are called to actualize our life of faith in this way. I hope you have a beautiful start to your week. God bless you. We're here for you. We're praying for you. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything. Leave a note in the comments section. Send us a message on social media. Email us. Call us. We are here for you. God bless you, and have a beautiful rest of your day. And again, a beautiful start to your week.